Christopher for organizing this terrific conference, and thank you to Jeff Bagley for his work in putting this together. Christopher set a great tone by being really brief, so I'm going to keep it up. And I just wanted to welcome all of you to the law school. The issue of privacy is a fundamental one for the 21st century. And as you all know, because you are interdisciplinary, it requires a wide range of approaches to solve, or at least to think through even. We're not going to solve the question of privacy, but certainly to think through. And so that's why we're really happy as a law school to welcome all of you. We pride ourselves on our interdisciplinarity, our faculty, and our students. And one data point that I will share is that 70% of our graduates last year had a joint degree or certificate in another program or school at Penn. And so that's just an example of how much we pride ourselves on interdisciplinarity. I myself am teaching a class right now that's cross-listed in the design school, and last fall I taught one that was cross-listed in the education school. So this is something that we take really seriously. I'm really glad that you're here. I know that you're going to see a fair number of our colleagues and students today, and I really want to thank you all for coming and welcome you, and hope you have a great conference.
Thank you very much, Dean Pritchett. And consistent with the tone that I set that Wendell picked up, I will keep the introductions relatively brief. As a result, you have full bios in the program, and the beautiful thing about this panel is I think that they need no introduction as they're leaders in their field. I often find when people say that they need no introduction, they immediately proceed with giving them an introduction. I decline to do that here because I think the most important part is to hear them speak and to get into the substantive program. But we are very proud of, as Dean Pritchett talked about, in the Center of Technology, Innovation, and Competition, we are attempting to push the study of this in different directions. Just to share with you a couple things we're doing, we are creating novel joint degree programs at the engineering school, and students who are participating that are here as guests and attendees today. We're reaching out to DC in policy outreach. We're trying to build not just a student community, but a scholarly community that we think is quite exciting. And I will not go further because it's one of my favorite topics to talk about, and it's very easy to get me going. So if you have any questions, please talk. I encourage you to come discuss it with me and with Jeff Vogley here in the front, who's the executive director of the program and has been instrumental in organizing today. All right. Well, the beautiful thing about this panel is we have distinguished philosophers. The focus of this is on what the philosophical perspectives would be on the end user's ability to, the end users taking responsibility for privacy. And I'm responsible for changing the slides. It's always dangerous to get a lawyer in charge of technology.
Up to top right.
Top right. Oh, where is this? How do I toggle between here? This one. There we go. And our first panelist today is Anita Allen, who is our Vice Provost for Faculty, and most importantly, our friend and colleague across the hall from me as the Silverman Professor of Law and Philosophy.
Wow, thank you, Christopher. And good morning, everybody. I'm really glad you're here. And because I am beyond thrilled that this event is taking place and that I'm able to speak this morning. So, this is a photograph of a New Yorker who's sleeping on his sofa in his apartment. It was taken by an artist, photographer named Arnie Svensson, who was sued by his neighbors because he took lots of photographs of people through their windows, kind of Alfred Hitchcock rear window style. And, you know, in the lawsuit, one of the questions asked was, well, if people do stuff in front of their open windows, do they have any privacy interests or privacy rights at all? If people don't want their privacy disturbed, shouldn't they take responsibility for protecting their own privacy? This person could have closed his shades, he could have, you know, closed his windows, or could have slept elsewhere. So, you know, we're going to be talking today about not sort of these kinds of physical privacies, but more about informational privacies. What can we do, and what should we do to protect our own privacy? So the goal of the overall conference is, of course, to better understand responsibility for protecting one's own privacy and data security. But philosophers, like myself and Helen and Adam, I believe can contribute careful understandings of why we ought to ascribe or take responsibility for our own data protection, especially ethical responsibility in the form of duties, obligations. And then the second thing that we philosophers can help understand is how individuals can meaningfully take responsibility, especially in light of all the practical limitations on our agency, our lack of control, our lack of power, political and otherwise, and our lack of knowledge of how the technology works. I am going to be focusing today mostly on the first of these two sorts of philosophical questions. How, not so much how to do it, but why to do it. But on the how question, as it relates to ethical responsibility and what we might do because of our need to respect persons and be mindful of moral utility and character, on the ethical side, I believe that there are things that we could do, but I don't want to, again, I don't want to focus on these today. I want to let other people focus on these. But we could eschew technology, we could all try to become ultra tech savvy, buy a lot of stuff, listen to our IT guys, and practice moral reserve. We can try to organize consumers together to fight, the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, and we can try to influence public policy through our voting and our lobbying. But eschewing technology, come on, it's not going to happen, right? We love our Apple watches, and we're going to love our Google glasses, right? Become tech savvy, some of us maybe can, but most of us cannot. I identify with those ladies on the right there, right? Acquire self-help products. I don't know what to buy. Do you know what to buy? Do ordinary people know what to buy if they want to meaningfully protect their own privacy? Organize consumer pressure and put on consumer pressure on industry and government. Well, but we don't have a Rosa Parks, We don't have a Martin Luther King to kind of focus us and to lead the charge. So there are problems there as well. Listen to our IT guy. This is my favorite IT guy at Penn, Joshua Beeman. I listened to him. He got me to change my password after 17 years of having the same password. He got me to change my password. And then influence public policy. Well, again, there are barriers to doing that, but it's clearly something which we ought to do. But again, I'm not going to be focusing on the how to do it, but rather on the why to do it. Why to ascribe responsibility for protecting your own data, and why we ought to take responsibility for protecting our own data. So questions begin, such as what privacy means and why it's important. Helen and Adam have done landmark path-breaking work in philosophy on these kinds of questions. Why, if privacy is important, people have a responsibility to safeguard other people's privacy and their own, and then whether people can really have self-regarding obligations, and if so, whether privacy is the kind of thing about which there can be self-regarding obligations. And I'm going to be focusing mostly on the second two questions, and I think probably Adam and Helen will be diving a lot into the first. I have spent a lot of time thinking, though, about the question of what is privacy, and I generally think of it in a very kind of bland, uninteresting way. It's just limiting access to people and personal information, but for the sake of some things that are very important, that might include civility, dignity, limiting government, being tolerant, respecting autonomy, respecting individualism, self-expression, good reputation, and so on, repose, respecting people's different traditions and practices. These are all reasons why privacy is important. And then there are needs to think about why privacy is not always the most important thing, but I do think that the case can be made and has been made quite persuasively that privacy has tremendous ethical value. But now here, I want to just let you know that if you start to think really sort of carefully and in detail about the idea of responsibility for your own privacy or protecting your own privacy, and the idea that you might have a duty not just to other people to protect their privacy, but a duty to yourself or respecting yourself to protect your own privacy and data security, you run into some very thorny philosophical questions about which philosophers have thought a little but not a lot. And there are two categories of objections that I want to identify that are important. There's a whole bunch of conceptual objections to things about it, and then there's what I call the libertarian objections. The conceptual objections relate to the problem that there is something a little odd or tricky about saying that there are ethical concerns about yourself. Because for some people, some philosophers, ethics is about how we treat other people. That's what ethics is all about, how we treat other people. So if you're going to argue that ethics is not just about how you treat other people, but about how you treat yourself, you got to do a little bit of work. And I'm very influenced by Kant and by Kant's solution to the puzzle over whether there are duties to oneself. And I think that Kant argued that there is an obligation to act whether in your own person or in the person of others, to respect humanity. And if you believe that everybody matters, then why shouldn't you yourself matter? If you yourself matter, why is it that only other agents have obligations respecting you? Why don't you have obligations respecting yourself? And my view is that we do have duties that include duties of self-care and respect regarding ourselves. That we have an imperative to act and omit in ways that further our own interest in safety and freedom and security, and also dignity and integrity. And privacy does relate to those kinds of values. So I do think it's a challenge. Not everybody has this kind of Kantian perspective, but if you do believe that there are such things as moral duties or moral responsibilities, again, I think an argument can be made that they also apply to you because you yourself matter as much as other people matter. Indeed, Kant argued that duties to oneself are logically and morally prior to duties to others, because if you don't work on yourself to make yourself have the capacity, the agency in order to respect other people's privacy, you can't do it. So clearly you must take care of yourself and also take care of others. So that's one way of thinking. But I just want to give you a sense of how one could get really, really mired in some very complicated issues if one really takes the questions we're asking today as seriously as they deserve to be taken. So putting aside for a second the conceptual objections to the idea of having an obligation to yourself to respect your own privacy, there are what I call the libertarian objections. And these have to do with the fact that for some thinkers, privacy is construed as an option. It's an optional thing. It's like you can choose a blue car or a red car. You can choose privacy or you can choose disclosure. And it's up to you. It's completely up to you. There's no ethical or moral responsibility that can tell you how you should exercise your freedom. It's a freedom. It's not something which can be imposed on you by morality or by the law. But I think that way of thinking about privacy is wrong and problematic. Because if you take as your foundational premise that privacy has great value, it has value, as some would argue, as a human right, an ethical obligation, then how can it be that it's completely up to you whether or not you choose to protect privacy, your own? And I think that if you're not taking privacy seriously if you're saying, well, you can take it or leave it. It's like a blue breath mint or a white breath mint. It's up to you to choose which one you want. I think of it a little bit the way I think about slavery, right? I mean, we are free, but there's some things we're not free to do. We're not free, for example, morally free to sell ourselves into slavery. Why? Because being subjected to other people's authority it undermines one of our basic freedoms, our foundational core freedoms. And I see privacy a little bit like that it's one of those core freedoms, those core capacities that we have an obligation to show regard for and to not give it up, and not see it as something which can be given up totally as a matter of free choice. We should bind ourselves to be private the way we bind ourselves to be free. Binding ourselves to be private the way we bind ourselves to be free. So that's my response to the libertarian objection. It's a very powerful objection today because, of course, lots of people are arguing that being part of a social network, being open, being a person of just great disclosure and honesty and transparency is itself a moral good. So now we have a clash between moral conceptions. The moral conception which says, exercise privacy, reserve, and all those modesties of perspective saying, don't do that. Be open. Enjoy the way technology allows us to be in network with others, not to be closed and alone. So I think that there's a battle there, and we can talk more about that during the Q&A. So my perspective is that despite social pressures to share and despite limitations on our agency because of our limited power and knowledge, there's still room for personal responsibility for protecting our own data. And it seems to me that chiefly where we can do this are in the areas of exercising what I call moral reserve and character relating to sharing and protecting data, and to taking simple consumer data protection measures, including changing your passport after more than 17 years. On the first one, this is so interesting. We have so many examples in public life of people who don't do this. Anthony Weiner, right? I mean, remember that guy, the member of Congress who tweeted images of his groin area to strange women. I mean, this is someone who does not exercise moral reserve, right? He doesn't get it. He's a poster child for not getting what I'm talking about, this idea that we have an obligation to protect our own privacy. He treated himself with a lack of respect for his own dignity and his own humanity. There are other examples we could give as well. That Geraldo Rivera, published that photograph of himself in his naked. He was so thrilled one day to discover how, despite being 112, he was still all buff, and he published a picture. Well, these are examples of people who sort of don't get what I'm trying to say we should do, which is exercise some moral reserve. But it's difficult because there are lots of good reasons to share information. Educational reasons. People benefit from hearing our stories, right? Self-expression itself has value. Art has value. But I do think that there's grounds for moral reserve. Why should we practice moral reserve? I think that we do it to protect our own futures. We do it in order to sort of attend to lots of activities that give lives value that cannot be performed or enjoyed in public. We do it to avoid harm and self-degradation. We do it to honor our commitments and our promises to ourselves and others. We do it to exhibit appropriate modesties. We do it to model conceptions of self-respect and respect for others and human flourishing. So there are lots of reasons we can give for why people should practice reserve, and practicing reserve is one of the things we can do to take responsibility for our own privacy, along with changing our passwords, understanding a little bit about how browsers work and so forth. So I'll just briefly conclude here by saying that what we can do at a very minimum is to exercise reserve in our personal lives and exercise some character tied to sharing and protecting data. We can also take some simple consumer protection measures, and we can vote privacy. That is, when it comes to making policy and deciding public policy, we can vote privacy when we have a chance to. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Helen.
Thank you very much for including me in this event, and I specifically want to thank Anita for allowing me to come out the closet. I'm a philosopher. So it is really great to be on a panel that is philosophical and perhaps still make connections with some of the issues that legal people or people in other fields in this really growing world of privacy are concerned about. And I was going to, and I still will, talk about some of the work that I've done on this, the regime of notice and choice, which is so dominant in the area of privacy. But I really wanted to connect to the very specific question that this panel was asked to address, which is taking responsibility for one's own privacy. And the way I started thinking about it, and indeed, Anita, it kind of segues very well with your work, because I am, I think, to some extent addressing the second point that you mentioned in your slide, but to think through the question of what it would mean to take responsibility for one's own data privacy or one's own data security. I wanted to think about how you would ask that question in relation to other values or goals that we might have, and it does make sense to say things like taking responsibility for one's own education, for one's own health, for one's own financial security, for one's own safety on the roads. So I want you to hold this thought and now turn to what we have, the privacy regulations that we have in the United States, because it may seem that if we do subscribe to the idea that people should take responsibility for their own privacy, you want to have a set of laws, let's say, or a set of circumstances in which you give people choices. Because to hold people responsible and to make people responsible, you don't want to make the choices for them. You don't want to force them to make certain choices. You may, but the meaning of to take responsibility is to observe that you have choices and make the right choice, and that's what it means to take responsibility. So we could look at the fair information practice principles for one set of principles that I think embodies this idea to give individuals the opportunity to make certain choices in regards to their privacy. You can look at the statutes that we have, and I'm looking at, say, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act privacy rules of 2000, the HIPAA privacy rules, the education law that we have passed in 1974, the Video Privacy Protection Act. Now, what's really interesting about this is that each of these laws does involve substantive regulations, substantive prescription and prohibitions on certain sorts of things. But there's always this little escape clause that says, you must do this, except if you get the individual subject's consent to do otherwise. So that, you could say, really embodies the notion of choice and allows individuals to take responsibility for their own privacy. And of course, no other place than the online environment really reflects this idea where we say the relationship from the very bottom upward is going to be defined by this mechanism called the privacy policy in the term of service, in which the website or the company behind the website, but any website, has to declare what the rules are, and then the individual can make the choice either to go for it or not. And isn't that ultimately what it means to take responsibility? So as a result of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, this is the kind of thing we regularly get in our mailboxes, and I don't know, I tried to understand this and ask questions about it, but I couldn't. And this is the kind of privacy policy that we get, and I'm sure anyone in this room has probably looked at a privacy policy. This is Obama's privacy policy. This is Udacity, one of the MOOCs, and I wanted to point out that at the bottom, I'm not sure if you can read it, please be sure to return to this page periodically to ensure familiarity with the most recent version of the privacy policy. And I want to mention that my colleague who's sitting here, and you'll hear from later today, Florencia Marotta-Wogler. Oh, Florencia, I've got a typo in your name, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
How often these policies actually change, and I think we all know that it's utterly unrealistic. But you should go to Alcoholics Anonymous very often, because they have a fantastic privacy policy. They're very firmly saying they do not collect information, and you don't have to go back regularly. Well, you don't have to check on this regularly, because this is what they do. So what are some of the problems? And already I've kind of given things away in the way what I've shown you and how I've described. And I'm really reporting on a lot of work that other people and many of the people in this room have already done. First of all, when we talk about choice, there's been a lot of debate about how do you operationalize choice, and a question of whether you opt in or opt out. At the moment, you need to opt out, and there are many studies that show that there's an enormous difference as to whether you present it as an opt-in or opt-out. And Joe Turrow often will say, and I love to hear him say, that privacy policies by no means should be called privacy policy, because that's really a misnomer. Of course, they're unread, they're unreadable and incomprehensible, and there have been great studies that reveal just this. Now, there have been those who I've labeled critical adherents who point out that a lot of the problem here isn't fundamental, but it's really the poor operationalization of this particular regime of transparency and choice, or notice and choice, and that we need to work on, and there has been excellent work on this, more comprehensible privacy policies, more usable choice architectures, opt-in, opt-out, just-in-time, tiered consent, and more effective notice. And Ryan Kalo has, and I think we'll hear a little bit about that today, has done some really excellent work on this. Now, I don't think these approaches resolve the problem, which is taking responsibility for one's own privacy in this manner. And I've written with Solon Barocas an article that talks about big data's end run around notice, anonymity and consent, and I'm now going to focus on the consent question. And that is that, as we all know, with the increasing importance of data and the increasing complexity of the data environment, you have tremendously more actors who are part of the data flow environment. You have a lot more information that not only can be collected directly in online or other interactions, but also information that can be inferred from that. Give us your zip code sounds very innocuous, but and you might think you're choosing whether or not to give, but what you don't know, or many people don't know, is that when you give the zip code, there's a whole lot of other information that arrives with that. And there's a lot more activity going on in the background. So when you're consenting, what exactly are you consenting to? This is very difficult to figure out. And sometimes it's not only that it's hard to figure out, but that it's sort of unpredictable what we can figure out. So even with the best of intentions and with a long, long, long privacy policy, the website who's trying to give the individual a choice is not able to offer all the things that could happen as a result of what collection is going to take place. It's impossible to foretell the future. And, my little thing about PSE&G saying, well, if you have a smart meter, we hope you enjoyed your vacation. This is a diagram of everything that happens between the marketer and the consumer. There's the publisher of advertising the consumer online. This is the complex set of entities that are involved in the tracking and the behind-the-scenes analytics. And so, how do you explain to give a proper choice so that people can take responsibility for their privacy? So something I've called the transparency dilemma, which is to say your privacy policy can be comprehensible or comprehensive. There can be simplicity and clarity in it, or fidelity, but you cannot have both. And finally, and this is the part that we focus on in the paper on the big data's end run, sometimes consent doesn't even matter, because a lot of what entities know about you comes from not whether you consent or do not consent to revealing some information, to presenting yourself in a certain way, but for example, those with whom you explicitly have ties, such as those who are friends with you in a social network, because these friends can reveal things about you, first by your simple affiliation with those friends, and second, explicitly, as I say, they take photos of you and then they tag those photos on their profiles. But even beyond this, as we learned in the target case, you can infer characteristics about individuals. You can give them a choice to tell you whether they're pregnant or not, or as target revealed, if you fall in a cluster with certain people and the other people have revealed, and I think this goes a little bit to your point, and maybe I would add to what you were saying, Anita, is that one of the other reasons that you need to have reserve is in order to protect privacy not only of yourself, but of other people as well. So what should we do? Is paternalism the answer? Maybe I'm coming down on the directly opposite side as you and say, well, look, it's just impossible for people to take responsibility for their own privacy. Maybe the law should fully undertake this task because individuals sure can't do it. It's become too difficult. But I don't think we need to go all that way. I think partially yes, but let's go back to this question of taking responsibility for one's own data security or for one's own data privacy. Now, we know that this is not the right way to go. I don't know why we still are doing it. It's like this great inside joke. All of us who write about the subject, and I have not done empirical research, but others have done outstanding empirical research over and over again. This is impossible to understand. 9-page privacy policy that you could read if you went to Google. So when we go back to those initial questions, taking responsibility for one's own education, health, and so forth, and I think there's genuinely a case to be made that one can. I want to take away the one's own, because I think the only way you can take responsibility for one's own education is if there's someone, and I don't think it's for the individual, to be able to take responsibility for education, health, financial security, entertainment, road safety. I mean, just take road safety. I can be a careful driver, but I'm doing it in a certain context of the infrastructure of the roadways, the speed limits, and so forth. There's still an important role for the individual to take responsibility, but it has to be in the context of a certain kind of infrastructure that makes it possible for me to have an education. I mean, you may be able to have take responsibility without a societal system of education, but most of us are not able to do that. So this is what we don't want. This, I often show this picture because this is the sort of thing I think eventually we want to get to when we do give people choices, but the choices look like this. We make a lot of assumptions about what is and isn't going on, and then we reveal just a few additional points about it. You know, if you want to go into Washington Square Park, it's nice smooth pathways. You might think you could skateboard, but actually you can't. And there are lots of pigeons, and really you shouldn't feed the pigeons, however tempted you are. So we do show you certain things so that you can take responsibility for them. But there's a whole lot of other stuff we all assume we're not supposed to do when we go into Washington Square Park. Now, this is a little bit more complicated, but I think it's also all right. This is a beach in Abu Dhabi, and these are all the things you're not allowed to do if you want to go on the beach in Abu Dhabi. For example, men cannot go onto the beach in Abu Dhabi by themselves, fully clothed, because that means that the only reason you're going on the beach is to look at the women swimming. So there are sort of surprising things that you may not know about going to a beach in Abu Dhabi. So how do we achieve all this? I think, this is a long story, and I'm just going to take one more minute of your time. We need to build the institutional backdrop, and I'll just say this morning, I missed the bus to come from the hotel here, but I took responsibility for getting here on time. I'm a hero. Well, not really, because I went to the hotel and they said, cross the road, walk down a block, and there's the trolley. And I did it, and it was so well organized, it got me here in 15 minutes. So even though it was me taking responsibility, I could only do it because the system was in place. And that's what I think we need to do for privacy, to allow us, to enable us to take responsibility. And as many of you know, my theory of privacy is contextual integrity offers ways to do it, context by context, articulate baseline norms with a view, and I share this point with Anita, to the ends, purposes, in values in sight. Some will be embodied in law, and you still do leave room for, but you don't trump. You leave room for choice, but these rules should not be trumped by choice at all times. Thank you.
Adam Moore.
So I'll build upon some of the themes that's already started. First, I want to thank Christopher, Jeff, and Anita for inviting me. It was a heck of a time getting here yesterday, but I'm happy to be here, and it looks like a great program today. I'm going to I try to keep this short because I like to have lots of questions and discussion. So I only have I think about 11 slides. I'm going to go back to kind of first principles. Philosophers love to do that. You have a panel of philosophers here, so some first principles. I do like the idea of talking more about the why than the how, although I'm in an information school, and so a lot of my students are interested in building apps or devices that actually allow me to take responsibility for my own privacy and practicing reserve, as Anita said. But I like to get to I want to get to how I would define privacy, because I think that's important to why I think privacy is valuable, and then that allows me to say some things about how you might waive privacy rights or moves we might make in terms of technology. So I define privacy as in basically two forms. There's a physical part or a locational part and an informational part, and more often than not we're talking about information, but I like to talk about physical privacy too. So it's a right to control access to and uses of specific locations or spaces, if you like. And it's also, an informational side is the right to control access to and uses of personal information. So I don't particularly like non-normative conceptions of. I build the notion of rights and normativity right into the definition. I think non-normative conceptions don't get us very far. That I have a capacity doesn't seem to be important to me. That I have a right to control access to and uses of is what I'm after. And I will defend this conception of privacy over drinks if anybody cares to take me up on. We all have to take some scotch, and then we'll have at it. Philosophers love to fight about definitions, and you can define privacy a lot of different ways. But for various reasons, I like this definition. So why do I think privacy is morally valuable? And I've made this claim and defended it. And just give you a brief overview here. I think privacy rights are essential for human well-being or flourishing. So I'm a kind of a neo-Aristotelian, if you're into the old stuff. But I'm a eudaimoneist about privacy and value. So I think it is essential for human well-being or flourishing. It is a culture. I do think it's a culture universal, building on the work of Alan Weston, and talking about rituals of association and disassociation, of coming together and leave-taking. It is a lot of these rituals are very important. They're contextually dependent, but I think the need is actually an objective need for our species. So just some brief points on this, and making good on this claim that privacy is essential for human well-being or flourishing. So there is a lot of links between privacy and psychological disorders and physical disorders. A lot of interesting work done by Calhoun, and he did work on non-human animals, rats and whatnot. But you take these different organisms and you take away their ability to withdraw, and you see some weird stuff popping up. Rat psychology, they go sideways on you, and that's all that. This is true for humans as well. When we look at household overcrowding studies, a lot of this has to do with physical privacy, and we do see some of this in relation to informational privacy as well. But we'll get to that in a minute. But you take humans and you, whatever their culture, and you deny them ability to take the ability to take leave from their fellows, and you see an uptick in recidivism, aggression, recidivism if it's criminals and all that kind of thing. So we get these points as well. So the studies we do have on this, and they're hard to get by ethics boards, that it does look like when we deny humans this capacity or this ability, or right, if you like, you get an uptick in violence, suppression, suicide, mental disorders, and so on. And then it's pretty clear privacy is group preserving, allows us to maintain status divisions and so forth. Some of my most recent work, I just got an article out, coming out soon. It's called Privacy in the Family, and the question there we were thinking about is, should privacy rights hold between family members, and what happens when they don't? So what happens when parents, I have a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old, what happens when I monitor my kids covertly or overtly or whatever? And we come to find out that some actually very interesting studies that show that when you monitor the right way, you get good results. And when you monitor the wrong way, you get the very same kinds of things we see in Calhoun's rats or prison studies. So if you establish a practice of two-way information sharing with you and your kids, it's a way of monitoring. You say, how's your day going? And and you volunteer information, they volunteer information. You get good results. I just said, good, bad, put it in simple terms. If you monitor using extreme rule sets, you can't play with this person or that person, you're going to be home by 5, and then you set up some system of further monitoring, you get these bad outcomes for children. They drop out of school, they use drugs early, they have problems with aggression, and so on. These are studies that came out of, they studied, I think, 7,000 14-year-old boys in Sweden or Switzerland. I can give you the sites if you like. Same thing with covert monitoring. That's viewed as kind of abandonment of kids. And they have these bad outcomes, and overt monitoring can have these effects as well. I think so. When we just look at this stuff and we see how people control access to whether it's physical or informational, their informational lives, I think it's we can make good on the claim that it is very important having this ability and this right to control access to. I don't like the notion of privacy as a mere interest. I think that undermines its importance and value. So this is one I've been pushing this for a long time, that if you view privacy as a right, maybe like a right to property or right to liberty, it changes things. If it's just a mere interest, well, I have an interest for pizza later today, right? I mean, I get it. Who cares, right? But if you're going to take a property right from me, that changes things. All of a sudden, I have due recourse to just and fair recourse to the courts and all kinds of things. So I like the talk of rights here. Now some remarks about the actual subject of this panel. I think so. I do think individuals or end users have primary responsibility for protecting their own privacy. But I do think so. I guess I'm going to defend in some ways the piece that Anita was attacking, the kind of libertarian views. I think in most cases you can alienate these rights. Even though I think privacy is very important, like I think property or liberty is very important, I can alienate my liberty rights. I trade liberty for a paycheck, maybe a 40-hour work week. I may trade property. I may trade a gift, sell, or alienate my property rights to a specific item like a phone. And I think privacy is very much the same way. I can, via my actions, I might waive it, I might forfeit it, a privacy claim. I also might trade it for different kinds of things. And so I don't view it as important as like some people might call a basic right that cannot be waived or alienated, like maybe my right to life or something like that. Although I can certainly forfeit that right. And I've started thinking about privacy now. If you think of it in these terms, as I teach copyright and IP law sometimes as well, and I was thinking about copyright and whether you can view privacy as a kind of copyright. And then I started thinking about the first sale rule of copyright and how that's been undermined by the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and now it's all licensing, right? So what if we look at think of privacy and my right to control access to and uses of information and locations as a kind of license that I give to others? So I let a company or an organization or whatever have some use and control over information for limited times and for specific purposes. But I do not, by sharing that information, waive all future downstream control or uses of or over that information. And that seems to be the flaw in our system to me. According to my definition, I can, a right to privacy, a right to control access to and uses of. So I may give you a right to use information or have information about me for some time or for some specific purpose. That doesn't mean I've waived all future claims to that information. Yet that seems exactly one of the things it seems our system is kind of set up along that dimension. And so I'm thinking about this notion of kind of license. So I give you a kind of control, like maybe renting a movie or whatever. It's a kind of idea. So I think individuals have primary responsibility, but they're not the whole of it. So I think, let's say this consent argument. This pops up a few times. Well, we consent. I am waiving my privacy rights all the time. And when I step into the public domain, I'm consenting that other people know I'm there, and what I'm wearing, and I give all kinds of information in my smartphone and all that. And I don't think it's a very good argument, the consent argument, that we waive all this. First of all, I note that this consent to access doesn't mean consent to all future downstream uses of. No one would think that I consent that you come into my house. And that doesn't mean I've consented to you whenever you want to come into my house, right? So as soon as you switch it, it starts to change the notion of privacy when you link it up with property. I don't like, people say you can opt out. I mean, but I don't know how you opt out. We have this massive information gathering system in place. What would I do? Wear a disguise, pay with cash, wear a mask, which is illegal in some states. I think the Target case is a good case too. What this young lady did, she may have consented to Target gathering some information, but she certainly didn't consent to them doing these analytics on that information and finding out that she was pregnant and then disclosing that to her father. So I don't think the consent argument for waiving is actually that good. I think governments have some responsibility for protecting privacy, our privacy. I think virtually every political theorist will say that a legitimate or primary function of government is to protect individual property, individual rights. One of those might be privacy rights. So, and as soon as you go down that line, I'm off on my. Our government is both as a protector of privacy, but it's is for a long time been a violator of individual privacy as well, as the revelations from Edward Snowden show us. In terms of paternalistically mandating privacy, I think privacy is very important and very valuable, but I do think I can waive it or trade it, so in some sense I'm holding a different view than Anita Allen, in terms of there's some areas where I'm certainly willing to say it's a transferable good, but I do want the government to create a framework, a legal framework that helps me protect my privacy if I choose. And I think Helen was talking about this in a lot of her slides. So I do like an opt-in model, maybe with pop-up technology. I like the idea of my students creating apps that allow me to mask my data and what I'm doing. So when people do gather information about me without my consent, it's junk information. So I think there's certainly a role for government, and I think there's a role for corporations as well. I do like some of the new cases that have been popping up. The AT&T case, this quote of failure to reasonably protect consumers' personal information violates federal communications law. If you're a business and you're going to collect information about me and then store it, then you open me up to risks that I may not have consented to, and I think that's an important feature when your system is then hacked and I'm then harmed. So I do think there's responsibility there as well, and this is, I guess, part of the system I think we need to talk about. So just to conclude, so we can get to, I would say basically most of it falls on the side of individuals, but I do think governments and corporations also have responsibilities. I'll stop there. Thanks.
You've all laid out what I think of as very interesting conceptions of how we derive a duty for the scope of what the responsibility of individuals should be. And so, Anita, you're basically taking a Kantian perspective, and that you're saying that there is an area where we should exercise reserve. And though I'm fascinated is that you use different methodologies to derive the content of what you should be able to do and should not be able to do. So, Adam, you talk about, yes, you can alienate certain rights or waive certain rights, but it shouldn't be all of them. And then raise the question, what is the content of what is it we do not allow people, or we should constrain people to do in blanket alienation and not? And what strikes me is the source of the rights are quite different. Anita, you take an ascriptive vision where you base on a coherentist vision about what it means to be a person based on analytic philosophy. Helen, you've talked about the inability to comprehend, which is a much more contingent one, but also the implications on third parties who are unable to protect. And Adam, you talk about human flourishing. And what strikes me is those are very different methodologies. I'd be really interested to see you describe more the contrast between them, where they take you in, and how we really determine what's in and what's out, because that's where the hard part's going to be. So Anita, starting with you, when we think about what things we have, you're suggesting we have individually a duty to protect certain rights, certain information from being disclosed.
Yes.
If I'm trying to turn that into an operational system, how do I think about what's in and what's out?
Yeah, okay, so that's a good question. So how do you decide what's in and what's out? And I just threw out some examples that didn't involve information necessarily. The Anthony Weiner example, but we can talk about, Snapchat mom, the woman who, posts the pictures of her and her daughter in the hot tub, half naked on Snapchat. And people, other examples, people use the internet to disclose information. And how do you get, what is the sort of Kantian perspective of respect for persons and respect for dignity and respect for core? How does that generate concrete guidance? I think you're looking for guidance, right? How to be guide, yeah. So I would say this to you. It's not harder to think through the question of what ought we do when it comes to data protection than any other area of life, raising a family, or you say, well, how do you decide what this means as far as say crime goes? Is prostitution going to become? Should prostitution be prohibited morally? Should stealing? Should walking down the street without a hat? Should going to the beach with your clothes on be prohibited? And these concepts of dignity or respect for persons, one has to articulate a vision. And I don't think that my particular vision of what respect for persons and dignity requires might necessarily be the same as yours. But what you go to are, so you have to sort of work on thicker conceptions. And so for me, for example, if you're giving information, for example, in my paper, my meter lecture on this topic, I give some examples. So what if somebody, discloses that they have cancer to their workmates? One might say, well, that's not a bad privacy disclosure, because after all, it's not. There's no shame in having cancer. You might get more support, more social support, more resources from your HR department if people know. But then suppose that same person were to post photographs of herself after surgery, photographs of her post-surgical wound, showing the mastectomy scar or the radiation burns, and would post those for the sake of her fellow workers knowing what she went through. That to me would be going too far. How does that relate to dignity or to humanity? To me, it's a matter of modesty. It's a matter of which I think is an important way in which we show respect for ourselves. It's a little bit. We open ourselves up to ridicule, so it's sort of a degrading. It's self-degradation to post very intimate images of oneself in the wrong context. I think I agree with Helen that context is everything. It might be appropriate in some ways. And so I think that we don't view the problem as unique to privacy. We see that we always have to take core values, liberty or freedom or dignity, and then to articulate a vision. And again, those visions don't always match.
So, Helen, I'm going to attempt to characterize what I understand you're saying, and as always, I'm likely to get it wrong, so the purpose of this is to provoke you to correct me. From what I understand, for example, the clearest point you make is in the reading you put on the website about you have an obligation going into it. Anita's putting it in an ethical framework to control your own privacy because other people can use big data analytics to find out things about other people. So in fact, there's a reserve you must exercise. But this is a consequentialist approach that will change contingently over time as opposed to a Kantian approach where you derive sort of a constant value. And when I hear you talk about a duty to exercise control of your own education and health, the way I trying to figure out why that would be a duty on me individually is probably some sort of spillover effects to society about public health and these different aspects. Am I correct that you're thinking about this in terms of consequentialist terms, that the scope of what you have an obligation to do depends on what that implication has for broader society, or is there a more individualist aspect that I'm missing?
I don't think that what I was saying necessarily commits to one of those or the other, but I do, just as a matter of fact, hold to the value of privacy in terms of the ends that it achieves. So if you work through the theory, for the most part, I do look at information flows in terms of the ends. So, but I think that the story I was trying to present today, first of all, it really depends, and I can see I have some pretty basic differences with Adam's view on privacy, which can be cashed out, it can be expressed fairly, I don't want to say easily, but it really is important to the picture that I was presenting that you understand privacy as appropriate flow of information and not necessarily as the individual's control over access, the right to control access. I wanted to make sure I got it right. And then every time there's a moment when you don't have control, we might frame it as either a violation or else you waiving the right. And I don't think of that as so productive, because it weakens privacy, because all the time we're waiving this right in order to live in a society productively. So I prefer to rather constrain what privacy is, so that a lot of the time we're sharing information and we're not waiving the right, we're actually exercising the right. So when you start with that view of privacy not as the individual's control, but rather as establishing and defending appropriate flow of information, then it follows, I think, from that the argument that I was trying to make, which is that sometimes it will be the individual who has an obligation to make that happen, and sometimes the individual cannot. It's just simply not something. And then we need to rely on the built institutional framework, which sometimes can be actually physically built, like schools or whatever, in order. So I'm really intrigued by this way in which you create an infrastructure that enables and promotes and defends appropriate flow, and then the individual has a role in that, in their own case, to make choices. And sometimes the choices they make, I think, can be critiqued, and sometimes the choices they make would have the ends that we believe privacy serves, and so forth. So it really does come down to how you define privacy, and then whose responsibility it is in addition to the individual. I don't know, did it answer the question somewhat?
And if there's a response any of you have, just signal me and I'm happy to let you say anything. If I have a question for you as well, Adam, but
okay.
If you'd like to.
Oh, sure. Yeah, well, I mean, I like the comments. I think maybe Anita and I may agree more on. I think it's perfectly right that we say that I think privacy is valuable, and because of that, I think it's maybe very important for you to show restraint. But I don't want to go to the. So I want to say if you're doing that kind of thing, it's a bad idea. Maybe I talk to you, maybe we shame you, maybe we come to philosophy classes or whatever. We have discussion groups, whatever it is. But we don't need the government to come in and say you didn't show restraint, so we're going to fine you, or we're going to do something. I don't know what it might be. So that kind of paternalism I'm opposed to, but the other kind, is fine. And I think Helen and I, we have different conceptions of privacy, and I think the work, it all comes down to the word appropriate, and there's where I want to get into the weeds. But philosophers can fight endlessly about these things.
But the thing that you said on your slide that's leapt out at me ever since it was there is several things. Is universals is a very different conception than a contextual conception, and also the argument tended to be based around some basic, if you will, empirical observations about the way people behave when they lose privacy. So if I understand the way you're constructing the argument, you are trying to establish some basic qualities of human nature that in circumstances under which they don't flourish based on an absence of privacy. But it's largely empirically based and generalized at a fundamental level that should be true for all people. Am I correct?
Yeah, right. So I say that the way we our methods of leave taking is culturally dependent and maybe contextually dependent. That's where Helen and I think would agree with with that claim. But the need, I want to say, is an objective fact about human beings. Much the same way as so much water. We need so much water to survive, or whatever. We can talk about plant flourishing. So yeah.
And I actually agree a lot with this idea of privacy being a need, and I think that it's not inconsistent with my perspective to believe that it's the need, and also it's something which is important because it's consistent with ideas of respect for persons or some sort of deontological. In fact, in my book on popular privacy, and also in the paper that I wrote on this topic about responsibilities for protecting your own privacy, I'm pretty explicit that one could make these arguments in Kantian terms, in Aristotelian flourishing terms, in utilitarian consequentialist terms, and in a way, I don't care which way you go. I mean, because I'm a part-time philosopher. I'm also a lawyer, right? I don't have time to be a kind of thorough, a soup to nuts kind of a philosopher. So I'm a little bit, fast and loose on which philosophical approach I take. I happen to be most, I think, congenial, simpatico with the Kantian approach. But I find no problem with focusing on the on consequences, how people are harmed or not harmed, for example, or on ideals of flourishing. To me, they're all important perspectives.
See, but what's fascinating to me is you framed it in terms of Kantianism, which leads you to conceptual absolutes and coherentist absolutes. But the one you chose is modesty as a primary example. And I keep thinking of, to go back a generation, how everyone complained in the 60s and 70s during the Summer of Love, how young people have no conception of, the changed conception of modesty. And I look at what I can find on the internet these days about what young people are willing to post about themselves voluntarily. I find it that modesty would be your frame from an analytical framework of Kant modesty almost begs a more socially contingent idea and a moving target. And I'm fascinated to see why you choose modesty as your primary, as an illustrative.
Example. Yeah. It's an example because modesty embodies the idea of of selectively disclosing intimacies about oneself, and also with selectively disclosing one's virtues and one's. So you go to Facebook and today, and people like us post things like, "I just gave the blah blah lecture. I just gave the keynote address at a great we brag in social media. We brag on Twitter. We brag on Facebook, and that kind of modesty or immodesty is just as important to me as people being naked. So it's not just modesty in the sense of the old-fashioned, cover up your boobs and your butt. It's also about moderating the extent to which you boast and brag and make other people feel bad, because that's something. So it's, to me, it's undignified in the Kantian sense to be immodest, and so modesty becomes sort of a second-order value, where the real concern here is about what is a way of being a person of dignity and self-respect.
And just follow. I think so. When you asked the question, you're like a Kantian or a consequentialist or whatever. I thought, well, I kind of put us all as kind of hybrid theorists, maybe.
Hybrid.
In the sense that so you could be a Kantian.
Opportunistic.
Yeah, you could be a Kantian who says I like virtues, right? And that's fine. Or you could be, John Stuart Mill says I'm a virtue theorist as well. So however you're getting at it, I think you could get to the virtue of modesty. But then where I will say is that I like the idea, and maybe we should be teaching our kids more about that. But I don't want to paternalistically mandate it. But sure.
So maybe I can give you something to shoot at. Even if you're all hybrid theorists, you all seem to be unified in the standard critique of what I would think of as libertarianism. Which is, that's the traditional notion that animates notice and consent. All of you express some degree of skepticism of this. And I guess the question is, can I at least unify you in a dislike for a libertarian conception? Because what I'm finding myself struggling with is, there seems to be ways you could actually reconcile this, because libertarianism posits the idea of a private realm that you have that exists. And the way I would make this all work is, you are all offering me different ways to derive the content of that private realm that's independent of mere preferences. Because if it's mere preferences, it all collapses into sort of this Panglossian idea that we left in the best of all possible worlds, unless we have some notion of failure. The other panels are talking about what people can and can't do process-wise, and to some extent Helen talked about this, but the philosopher really is talking about something much more fundamental, which is there's things not based on what you can do and can't do, but these are things you have to have. Certainly Adam and Anita more, definitely, and to some extent, I don't mean to put Helen necessarily in there. Right. Can we reconcile what you're saying with a libertarian framework? And if so, where are the, if not, where are the disconnects?
So I don't know if we're going to be accused of being libertarians, but when I think of
You mean anti-libertarian, so I mean,
Okay. So when I think about my views on privacy, and people have asked me this, does it lead to some kind of libertarianism? Because I'm asking questions like, what do I owe you in terms of information sharing? And I think I owe you relatively little, and you owe me relatively little. Other people who have different conceptions and have thicker views of what we owe each other will then say, well, I owe you a lot, you owe me a lot, and now accountability practices, and Anita's written on this, and so has Helen, jump in and give me your rights to go look at information about you. So it really, if you frame it like that, I mean, it could be quite libertarian, at least in some way. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I present some of these ideas precisely as a problem within libertarianism in a way, because there's this sort of puzzle. If you are a libertarian about privacy, that might lead you to think that it's up to individuals always to choose. But what if no one chooses privacy? I mean, what if you give people free choice and no one chooses privacy? They choose something else. Then you have a culture that's devoid of something that people need or benefit from or ought to exhibit in order to exercise their own self-esteem, their own dignity, their own integrity. So that's the problem. And so liberals and libertarians need to have within their theory of rights and ethics, and their legal theories, some space for dealing with the problem that if people choose not privacy, then we have a problem. And so my temptation to go down the road of paternalism is precisely to address that problem. Because we have to have people having privacy to some extent. We can't let everybody choose not privacy. That would be a disaster for our society and for individuals as well. So the law might be a tool for coercing certain kinds of privacy, like children's online privacy, about which some folks in this room have written, and other kinds of privacy that are sort of very important. We can't just let them go. I do think my views are in some sense anti-liberal libertarian, but they're also challenging liberals and libertarians with whom I identify to come up with a solution to this dilemma, this problem.
So I'm about to open the floor to the questions, so please, there will be microphones coming on, but I'll throw one last question to the three of you. We've talked a lot about different aspects of privacy. Let's focus more narrowly on information privacy. Helen, you most obviously have the point that, in fact, if the reading you gave us that we post on the website says, in a big data analytics world, information privacy, this is worse, not better. I mean, the vector is making this a bigger problem. And I'm curious as to see from the whole panel, do you think that the world we live in, digitization, these different aspects of it, in what ways does it make it worse? And is this a bigger problem, or is it the same in the sense that if you're looking at the prison crowding things, is that just a physical space issue, in which case information privacy doesn't matter, or is there something that I'm missing? So the thing that we're looking today, what are the challenges the technology is placing on us that affects the privacy concerns, and if so, which way is the vector pointing?
I hesitate to say in aggregate worse or better, because it's more to say that we have great opportunities with this technology, and we should take care to regulate information flows so that we can get the most out of it. Where I think that these fundamental philosophical questions can really make a difference to how we think about what it is to make things worse and better, and this is where I really kind of resist. I don't even know what libertarian means, because the current practice of libertarian discussion, and I'm not talking about those who have a very purely academic and well thought out view of it, is really to cherry pick. It's great cherry picking. Certain things are okay to regulate, and certain things are not okay to regulate, and I'm not sure it's very consistent. So, but the thing that I want to get away with and I have tried to do in the theory of contextual integrity, is really to say that appropriate flow, privacy as appropriate flow, is not all about harm to the individual. And so when we look at the challenges that big data and I use it in a very, big data, these large databases, analytics, predictive modeling, and so forth, what they're threatening, and I think we really need to take account of the big picture, is not only potentially harmful to the individual, but also potentially will undermine certain really valuable. And I think that Adam's discussion about family surveillance is a case in point. There's certain information flows that are really fundamental to certain values within a family, and let me just say trust might be one of those values, that if you place people under surveillance, whether or not they like it or not, but the truth is you're saying, I can't trust you. And so there's certain kinds of information flows that promote health in a family and at the same time promote the well-being of individuals, and sometimes it's not to the benefit of the individual, but it may be to the benefit of certain social values. And that's how I think we should do the reasoning. Then from there, we can tackle the problems, and I think, as I say, with all of these advances that we have in digital media and so on, there's a lot to be gained, there's a lot to be lost, and we need to do it on a case-by-case basis. Doesn't that sound like a political slogan?
Yeah, so I think technology and how it impacts privacy, I think it seems to me that privacy-enhancing technologies lag behind. It seems are lag, but they're coming around, right? So we have Tor, Bitcoin, all these things. I mean, and my students are building apps, right? That building these apps that will basically it'll send data. So my locational information will be all messed up. They'll think I'm in Ohio or Boston or maybe Philly, right? And so it's misinformation. There's these. The case I always bring up all the time. Sooner or later, we're going to have the possibility of what I call an anti-monitoring suit. It's a jumpsuit I zip on, and all you know is somebody's here. And maybe it even masks my voice. And if I had that technology, would I buy it? Would I wear it? Maybe I use encryption, and so we buy privacy-enhancing technologies when we have that disposable income. We do that with guards and fences and dogs and whatnot on larger estates, and we will buy this as well. So I think the problem right now is that the privacy-enhancing technology hasn't caught up with the privacy-invading technology.
And I think we used to believe that the market would just take care of this, that as the number of privacy-diminishing technologies and methodologies were invented, there just would be on the market, lots and lots of things. But I'm concerned about those privacy-enhancing technologies being sort of specialized and inaccessible and silly, and your example of the suit. People are they're gonna wear the Apple Watch. They're not gonna wear the privacy suit. But sure, I think it's gotten worse, Christopher. I think that our use of phones and various computing devices has made things worse. We have less privacy. We're losing our taste for privacy. It's a problem for our culture. We need to do something about it. Yet we're exhausted by the array of problems that Helen emphasized. The privacy notices are incomprehensible. The ways in which big data works are incomprehensible and out of our control. We don't control our health records. We don't control our financial records. We barely control our education records. We just don't have control of data about us, and it's a problem, and our ability to master it is a problem.
Well, at this point, we'll open up the floor to questions, if there's any. Please raise your hand, and we'll welcome microphone to you, because it is being, if you would wait for the microphone, it is being streamcast or livecast and recorded, and also if you'd identify who you are when you ask your question.
Hi, I'm Jackie Lewis. First, just a general observation. It was so marvelously ironic that there was a roving photographer taking our picture during our conference on privacy. What are you going to do with those pictures? A few years ago, there was a book called The Transparent Society, and the author somewhat provocatively posited that in this world of emerging technologies and Google Glasses, the cat is out of the bag. Information can't be protected, and the power, as always, lies with the person that has the information. So he argued that we should have increased transparency, give up our privacy to promote freedom, and as kind of a defense against fascism of the information being concentrated in the hands of a few hackers, government, and corporate interests. So just generally, how do you respond to that?
Well, I've written a lot on this topic, and I do think if you have, typically we like privacy, and if I have the power, this is what tenure gets you, right? As a professor, right, I can withdraw. There's certain things I can make myself immune from that kind of accountability or people looking. So if you give me the power and perhaps the money, I will, if I can, perhaps. This is maybe just empirical claim about the way humans are. So we need to. So one of my thoughts is that as we become more transparent, those in power now have the ability to demand a lot from us in terms of information, or they can just go ahead and, third-party doctrine, go figure out whatever they want to about me or you or anyone. When those same tools are used against the powerful and the elites, then maybe we'll actually get to a discussion about what we actually owe each other as citizens. Instead of just saying, I have the capacity to look at you and monitor you, and so I will, because it gives me power and control over you. So I'm hopeful that one day we'll get to that, but it's not today.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it's even, we're seeing the descendant of this way of thinking in a current notion that, as you say, the cat's out the bag. There's no way we can control collection, let's control use. And I mean, Bryn has this additional thing of transparency being such a great thing, but I'm totally pessimistic, and I think it's dangerous. The reason why we have things like the Fourth Amendment is because we know that power is abused by powerful entities. So if we give up the one defense we kind of have, then what gives us any hope that we'll still be able to control what the powerful can do through transparency?
So I agree with what's been said. So you could. It's a little bit intriguing to think about. We've tried privacy for several hundred years. Let's try transparency now. Let's see what the world would be like if we were all just completely transparent. That to me is a dystopic, world. I don't want to live in that world. And the fact that the world may already be that way, to more, greater than I would like, bothers me. I mean, why is there a camera? Why do we have to live stream everything? I think it's a real normative choice that we have to make. Do we want a world characterized by transparency? Do we want a world characterized by some privacy? Are they black and white options? Probably not. We probably want a little bit of each. But, we do have a lot of laws that protect privacy. Helen just mentioned the Fourth Amendment. We have at least 12 or 13 major federal privacy regimes, about which I hope we'll be hearing a little bit more today, our HIPAA and ECPA and COPA and so forth. And we have other constitutional 14th Amendment rights also that protect privacy. So if the cat is out of the bag, how do we deal with the fact that we have tort invasion of privacy, laws? We have all these constitutional regimes, and we have all these statutory regimes. What does all that mean if the cat is out of the bag? It makes us look. I used the word silly earlier. I used it again. Silly, trying to enforce all these laws if, in fact, the cat's out of the bag. I don't think the cat's completely out of the bag yet.
I had a quite different reading of David Brin's book, The Transparent Society. And the question he posed, I believe, is who watches the watchers? And his answer was the watched. That is, it was providing a reciprocal balance to the power that the watchers had. And an example would be who's sitting in the room in the department store monitoring the security cameras. Fine, we expect that that's a legitimate activity within some ranges, but if it's violated in some way, then we'd like to be notified. So he says, put a spy cam in the camera room where people are watching the cameras, and then they become accountable for their actions. And you could think about the NSA or any kind of police record keeping. Disclose it. Has to be disclosed. Maybe in real time, maybe with a week lag, maybe with a year lag, maybe with a 10-year lag. But the point is, then the watchers become accountable for their actions in the same way that they're monitoring the watched. So in my view, it is a reasonable idea. It's something worth considering. Won't solve all problems, but it's a way to consider making society more transparent by making the observers more transparent.
But if you follow that, then what entails is not only is there an obligation to protect certain things, there might actually be an obligation to disclose certain things. And if there's an inviolable core, maybe there's an inviolable part where we're, for the benefit of facilitating this kind of behavior, that we have to reveal information. I'd be curious to see any reaction you have to Hal. That was Hal Varian, of course.
Yeah. I mean, I think that idea of watching the watchers, the idea of sort of surveillance, these are very interesting ideas. I love the fact that here at Penn, if you go to our public safety office, they have a room in which people are sitting around watching video cameras that are posted all over campus for security purposes. But what I love about it is that the people who are watching us are not in cubicles. They're in a big open room, and each of the watchers are being watched. So I think this idea is very important. It makes me a little bit nervous that everywhere I walk on campus there's a camera, but it helps me to know that the people who are watching me are also being observed.
I also think, so first of all, I agree with you that sometimes when you live in society, you do have an obligation to reveal certain things about yourself. That's just fundamental. And no privacy right is going to be able to prevent that. The thing I disagree with Halvarian, now that I know who it is why do we have to make the contract? I fully subscribe to the idea of a transparency of the watchers, but why do I have to give up my privacy in order to be able to hold the watchers to being transparent in their, in their role? Let's say we're thinking about government, we could be thinking about corporation. I'm not sure that those follow, and I think that is the slide that David Brin wants to push us down.
I would say, add to that, I would also reject that again. There's some stuff going on at the NSA. I would like that they would be more accountable to us, and having all these documents redacted and all, I think is a mess. But transparency doesn't mean I get to know everything about them. I mean, their job has specific roles, and I think within their roles and responsibilities, I might have some claim to know what they're doing, but I don't have a claim to know what they had for dinner last night. That's what the Transparent Society is promising us, and that's why I'd like to see the kind of leveling of the playing field. Like I always say, if there are nanobots crawling around on the walls recording everything you do and say, everybody, all the time, so you can just go online, what's this senator doing right now? Then all of a sudden the playing field, we'd all be probably shocked by that, and maybe we could sit down and have a discussion. I don't need to know that about you, and you don't need to know all this stuff about me. So I'd like to know some stuff about the watchers, but not everything. I guess I'm modest.